Where they burn books, they will also burn people. Einer keiner. Before the war, Europe was alive with creative electricity. It pulsed through its cafes and classrooms, through symphony halls and marketplaces. Painters experimented with bold new visions. Musicians explored the boundaries of sounds. Writers confronted political turmoil with satire, philosophy, and a dream of a new world. Art was not a luxury, it was a language, a weapon, a foundation of identity. But as the 1930s darkened, this landscape of expression became one of the first battlegrounds of authoritarianism. For when a regime seeks absolute control, it does not begin with guns and prisons. It begins with culture, with silencing the voices that imagine alternatives, that question, that reveal. It begins with removing a society's mirrors. Living through the unthinkable. In the years leading up to the Second World War, the world stood on the edge of a cultural collapse. Books were burned, music was outlawed, paintings were confiscated, and entire communities were erased. Yet, in the darkest corners of ghettos, camps, hiding places, and exile, artists continued to create. Their art was not merely resistance, it was survival. This is the story of the painters, musicians, writers, and performers whose voices were nearly extinguished, but never fully silenced. Before the collapse, artists under rising totalitarianism. Long before the world plunged into war, artists felt the tremors. In Germany, the rise of Nazism reshaped cultural life with ruthless precision. Any art that challenged authority, questioned brutality, or celebrated diversity was branded degenerate. Painters like Kathy Kulowitz, known for her humanistic depictions of suffering, were stripped of their positions and banned from exhibiting. Felix Nussbaum, whose work predicted the coming horrors with haunting clarity, watched as his studios were raided and his canvases were declared as unfit for the German imagination. Sculptor Otto Freundlich, a pioneer of abstraction, saw his works destroyed. One was even used as the face of Nazi exhibition meant to mock modern art, known as degenerate art. This was only the beginning. A cultural purge designed to eliminate dissent and reshape identity through fear. Life behind walls. Art in the ghettos. When ghettos were established across Nazi-occupied Europe, they became overcrowded prisons sealed off from the world. And yet within these walls, art flourished as both a witness and escape. In the Therdenstadt ghetto, illustrators like Bedřich Frita documented starvation, overcrowding, and despair with unflinching honesty. Sketches so truthful that simply possessing them became a death sentence. Meanwhile, Charlotte Salomon, confined in the south of France but shaped by the trauma overtaking Europe, created Life or Theater, a painted autobiography that captured her internal world as the external world collapsed. Writers like Peter Ginz, barely a teenager, imagined moon landings while living behind barbed wire. And in quiet corners, Isle Weber sang lullabies to children, gentle melodies swallowed by a brutal machinery. These artists turned confinement into creation, knowing their work might outlive their bodies, even if they never lived to see freedom. Unthinkable spaces. Art in the camps. In concentration and extermination camps where death overshadowed every hour, the existence of art defied all logic. Yet art persisted, even here. In Auschwitz, violinist Alma Rose, niece of Gustav Mahler, conducted the women's orchestra. Music became currency, protection, and a fragile barrier against despair. Painter Dina Babbitt was forced to produce portraits of Romani prisoners at the command of Joseph Mengele. Her artistic skill both a tool of survival and a tether to unbearable ethical dilemmas. Elsewhere, Zoran Music sketched corpses and hollow faces in Dachau, images he hid, smuggled, and later transformed into a lifelong testimony. Yehuda Bacon, a teenage survivor, drew the crematoria from memory after liberation, his art becoming evidence in war crime trials. Art in the camp was not made for galleries. It was proof of existence, a desperate insistence on humanity. Exile, silence, and resistance abroad. Not all artists were imprisoned. Many fled across borders, continents, and oceans, but exile carried its own war. Marc Chagall, forced to leave France, watched as his community vanished. His paintings of flying figures and burning villages transformed into visions of loss and longing. Max Ernst, arrested multiple times before escaping to America, reinvented surrealism as a language of displacement. Writers and thinkers like Hannah Arendt, forced to flee Germany, reshaped the intellectual world while grappling with the destruction of their homeland. For these artists, the war was lived through memory, reinvention, and the unbearable knowledge that they had survived, while so many others had not. Liberation and the burden of memory. When the camps were liberated, the gates opened to a silence too deep for language. Survivors staggered into the world unprepared for their stories. Artists who returned to their craft found that the war had changed their hands. Their brushstrokes were sharper, their lines fractured, their colors muted or burning. Some, like Zoran Muzic, continued to paint emancipated figures for decades, unable to leave the dead behind. Others, like Yehuda Bacon, used art to teach, testify, and shape a moral map for the future. The war had ended, but for these artists, a new one had begun, the war to remember. Legacy. Why their art still speaks. Today we walk through museums and archives that house the works once hidden in walls, buried in boxes, smuggled through borders, or only remembered in fragments. We encounter the sketches of the starved, the songs of the condemned, and the visions of those who refuse to let culture die. We see ourselves, our fear, resilience, our capacity for cruelty, and our capacity for beauty mirrored in their creations. These artists force us to recognize a simple truth. Art does not die. Even when its creators are silenced, their work continues to speak. And through it, we are called to vigilance, because the suppression of art is always the first warning sign. In remembering these artists, we honor not only their talent, but their defiance. Their canvases, notes, poems, and performances are fragments of humanity preserved against impossible odds. Their art is their voice, and today, at last, we listen. Never shall I forget that night, the first night in camp. That turned my life into one long night, 7 times sealed. Never shall I forget that smoke. Never shall I forget the small faces of the children whose bodies I saw transformed into smoke under a silent sky. Never shall I forget those flames that consumed my faith forever. Never shall I forget the nocturnal silence that deprived me for all eternity of the desire to live. Never shall I forget those moments that murdered my God and my soul and turned my dreams to ashes. Never shall I forget those things, even were I condemned to live as long as God himself. Never.